If we're
Okay.
on. Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, thank you. And hello, everybody. And yes, as you can see, we've been nattering away about all things but our plans, what we do, and the challenges we sometimes face with regards to, yeah, getting these things underway. But just to introduce myself a little bit more to those of you who may be like, who on earth am I? My name is Dr. Richard Carter, and I'm a senior lecturer in digital culture at the School of Arts and Creative Technologies. And I guess my defining characteristic as an academic is that I'm a practice-based researcher. So the vast majority of my time now is really spent in the processes of making things, creating works, very creative works, whose particular format, functioning, configuration bears out the ideas that I'm developing as part of my research, either to sort of set them into motion, to put them to the test to see what they might do, and to kind of put forward what I call sort of more than verbal arguments. So I come from an English background, and in that context, the natural default response to any critical problem is to write a journal article about it or a book. But nevertheless, I'm interested in the idea of how we can use the energies and materials around us to put forward an argument. This idea that making something is a way of making an argument, and that's something that I very much am a very serious believer in. Now, I kind of caveat this sometimes, it depends on the audience, but I'm going to do so for today. Practice-based research, I think, can sometimes implicitly, depending on who you talk to, be treated as unserious, especially when it has a dimension to it that, at least with my work, is quite strongly speculative. So I'm aware that I'm speaking here as part of the Digital Heritage Lab. We think of things like experimental archaeology, which has a very long tradition, has a very particular set of contexts in which it's conducted in, and speculation isn't sort of an aspect of that. In my domain, when it comes to thinking through digital media and technologies more broadly, that speculative dimension can sometimes be treated as you are trying something out, throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks, that there isn't sort of a serious process at work here. Now, evidently, I think otherwise. I am very much of the view that critically informed experimental thinking, that's informed by research, is informed by the debates and discussions that we have, can actually seriously model the sometimes radical turns of practice and thought that are often called for in sort of various papers and books that I've read over the years, but then actually rarely lead to actually things being built, machine shop diagrams, lines of code. I see many more calls for new modes of going about the world, new modes of being, new modes of thinking, new modes of practice. But then I don't necessarily see that acted upon, at least realized in some form, particularly actually in a digital context. And so my work is very much about trying to be that practice in action, to see where it takes us, to see what we might ultimately learn. And so that ultimately is the kind of the some motivation that's driving me. Now, one thing I kind of mentioned, and I kind of I sometimes say this or I don't say that, but it's come up quite a lot recently. So I'm kind of saying this not because I'm trying to make a point, but because I think it's quite interesting. Many of my speculative projects, as perhaps you might see in the next few minutes, they often come across as very playful, and I think there is a playful dimension to them, no question, because they are very strongly speculative. And indeed, sometimes those conjunctions and energies, materials, ideas they bring together can sometimes even seem rather whimsical. It's like, what on earth is going on here? And many people say when they encounter my work, they feel that sort of sense of play, sense of whimsy quite strongly. And indeed, in many cases as well, they kind of go, oh, it makes me smile. They find something cheerful about it. And I have no desire to disabuse anybody of that reaction. But it's actually rather different to how I myself am when I'm doing it. I'm really actually having fun when I'm making my work. It's hard work, it's difficult work, often very challenging in terms of the technology and the practice and making it happen. But also the fact that I often deal with technologies and concepts that have very challenging stories behind them, very challenging histories, impacts on the world. And so, yes, I'm trying to reimagine them and rework them, and perhaps to find out where else we might go, which is perhaps a bit less bleak in some cases. But nevertheless, it's not done out of a sense of, again, I'm just throwing things at a wall and seeing what sticks. I'm actually trying very seriously to push these technologies to be something that we might not typically think of when we encounter them more widely in culture and practice. And so, yeah, that's the essence of what I'm trying to do. In fact, in some respects, I think one kind of characteristic of my work is I often think about it as a sort of deliberate courting of failure, to put forward imaginaries, technologies, and ideas that are indeed steeped in these histories, these traces, these legacies that are indeed often exceedingly harmful with regards to human and indeed the more than human world of which we are a part. And these projects that I make, they never escape these histories. They never escape these legacies, and they don't pretend to do so otherwise. They certainly are not trying to say, oh, we can do funny things with these technologies now, everything's going to be okay. Instead, it is acknowledging what's gone in the past. How do we move forward while still recognizing that in so doing, we're not escaping these harms, we're just trying to find a path forward in a very, very complex and charged set of contexts. And so, again, the point is not to suggest that there is nothing that we can do, that we are so overwhelmed by history, by legacies and harms and challenging politics that we just give up. That clearly is not a very productive way forward. We have to keep on fighting and resisting across multiple registers and durations. But nevertheless, I think it's to try to, it's to try to find a way forward that perhaps, at least when it comes to what I do, especially in digital media, thinks critically about what we're doing, thinks critically about where we might be going, and in the process of trying to move forward, perhaps to a more progressive set of vectors, nonetheless escaping, I think, some of the celebratory narratives that can very, very easily attach to digital media. Look at this digital revolution. Look at this latest product. Everything's going to be okay now this has been released. And I think the need to be really quite critical to court almost that sense of failure and tension deliberately, even as we try to move forward, is something that I really believe in, even if it is quite a sort of a tense thing to navigate. So I guess the way to summarize everything I've just said neatly is I work in the spirit of the artist Nam Yuen Pak, the sort of famous sort of media artist in the late 20th century. I use technology in order to despise it properly, to put forward stories about what else it could be, that resist the kind of sense of utopian inevitability or dystopian inevitability or necessity on the part of the latest developments, that we recognize that, yes, these developments may be happening, they don't necessarily have to appear before us in the way that they are often sold to us as being, and that there may be other directions we can go in as well, ways that indeed complicate some of the stories that we tell and indeed some of the lives that we lead using these systems. So what I'm going to do today in the time that I've got is really just take you through a few of my kind of different examples of my practice, and they all have kind of broad set of relations within this context, but nonetheless, I think what unites them is indeed trying to be kind of critically reflexive in terms of the modes of knowing and being that they embody, and maybe the stories that we tell as a part of it. And so in terms of just a little bit of just a bit more specific background in terms of where I'm coming at beyond these kind of broad observations, one of the things I care about is the relationships between digital media and the environment. And the two are very often kind of seen as a sort of oppositional for fairly evident reasons, but plainly there is a critical need to map the relationships between media, technology, and ecology more broadly in contemporary art and culture, to look at the developments that we are seeing and to recognize them and understand them at sort of durational scales and registers that go far beyond their apparently immediate concerns and context. So Timothy Clark calls this a sort of derangements of scale. So we see an object, we see a story in a particular context, and it makes sense at that level. But then you start to look at it as what it represents, let's say sort of 100 or 1,000 years from now, in terms of how it's made, how it's constructed, the effects of its impact on the world. And then suddenly it starts to look very, very strange. And you get this idea that boiling a kettle might be one of the most significant things that we do because of the energy consumptions involved and the impacts of that down the line. So it's very much a sense of understanding artifacts within a much bigger context, something which I'm sure for many archaeologists is not an alien mode of thinking, but certainly does seem to be an alien mode of thinking when it comes to digital media, which emphasizes the new, the now, and the revolutionary, and clearing out what's gone before. So artistic research, I think, is quite a good pathway for doing just this, as a way of trying to address and map these sort of more than human materialities, agencies, and scales in which everything that we do is ultimately embedded within, and perhaps to try to again envision potential futures that come out of recognizing these contexts and taking them seriously. What would the world look like if we do that? I mean, one plain example here, there's been much very intense critique around contemporary generative AI, energy, water, highly refined materials necessary to sustain it. The cost is absolutely appalling. But for all the intensive critique against generative AI today, those concerns map onto digital infrastructures more generally. Even the Zoom call, for example, has its own ecological costs as part of how it's sustained, how it's enabled. If we somehow magically got rid of generative AI, these ecological problems won't just disappear. They were already terrible beforehand. Generative AI just concentrates that. But interestingly enough, some of the rhetoric around AI is that it'll help us better map, understand, and model the climatic and ecological disasters that are taking place. And there is perhaps some measure of truth there, but these systems have their own ecological footprints. Even Earth observing satellites, weather stations, even if they are noble structures for noble ends, they nevertheless have their own ecological impacts. They are part of the material traces that they themselves are trying to map and measure as well. So there's a sort of cyclical entanglement here. Now, in response to some of these tensions from an artistic and media standpoint, there's been this nascent movement of permacomputing. Now, I don't want to say movement, it really consists of a sort of a handful of people around the world who use that label to characterize what they do. I guess to an extent, maybe I'm one of them. But what unites all of their kind of practice is advocating for experimental, speculative, alternative approaches to what computing technology is. How can we reimagine it in a context when these sort of maximalist technocentric approaches are off limits to us, either because of sort of increasing ecological harms, breaking down supply chains, or indeed we just want to make a better world by having our digital world tread more lightly upon it ultimately. So the pursuit in doing this, again, is not to somehow ameliorate the harms caused by digital systems and infrastructures. It's not to say that everything's okay if we just start using Raspberry Pis now. Instead, it's to consider possible computing futures that might ultimately manifest in the face of very serious ecological breakdowns. But key thing is there's a strong awareness of privilege in this context as well. People like myself, we have the luxury of being able to play with these things because they give us novel modes of aesthetic imagination. In other words, we can create interesting things with it, but we are not being forced to develop these technologies because we are being subjected to the harms that are being driven by an extractive, enclosing digital world. Indigenous groups trying to cope with those changes by implementing new systems for sensing their environment. They are doing those things not because it's a nice thing, but because they need to. People like me, we have the luxury of deciding otherwise. So there is a strong awareness that for those of us doing permacomputing, that we are very privileged in some respects to be able to do so. And we kind of reflect on that very much. And finally, I guess, wrapping all this particular strand up, there's been various calls over the past decade outside of permacomputing for modes of sensing practice, modes of sensing and knowing the world that engage what it means to try to sense and to know the world through digital systems and technologies, to engage their own limits as enterprises for measuring and mapping what we see around us, and in the process to try to enact some alternative epistemic, political, ontological articulations about what the world might be if we sensed it and know of it in a different way. So this call's been the likes of Sascha Engelman, Jennifer Gabris, is to think about, well, if we have an alternative modes of sensing that are much more sensitive to things that are not quantifiable, things that are ambiguous, things that are uncertain, and bring those to the fore rather than the highly quantified, highly digitized, highly stratified model of the world that can sometimes be presented back at us through climate modeling. What sort of world would be presented if we try to focus in on those kind of ambiguous elements? And would that maybe lead to a better way of being in the world? We don't know, but it's worth trying because, again, with a highly numerical model of the world is very powerful for knowing the changes that we've been seeing, but it's also partly responsible for those changes in that kind of world that can be measured, managed, and mapped exactly, a world that we can control through knowing it. And half the problems we face is the fact that the world is not like that, does not behave in these neat, packaged, mechanical ways. Do we need modes of sensing and mapping practice that better acknowledge that reality, that acknowledge the mess, the entanglements, the uncertainties, however unsettling those might be? So it's in this intersection then of all these different elements that my practice emerges. I'm trying to very concretely implement these speculative sensing and knowing systems to try to reimagine the relationships between the digital, the ecological, the more than human more broadly, to come up with these alternative maps of the world, or at least alternative ways of telling stories about these particular relationships, and in emphasizing some of their modes of failure, modes of friction, modes of resistance. So systems that try to draw attention to what they don't see, what they don't know, what they can't capture, what they can't enclose, and therefore, to an extent, by extension, all the systems we use to try to do just those things in essence. So I'm going to sort of, again, I've got these sort of three examples here. I'm going to probably be fairly swift as I go through them, because I know I don't have unlimited time, but again, we can ask questions if so necessary. So here's a photograph that I took a few weeks ago. When I am not an academic and when I am not an artist, I'm a glider pilot. And I spend a lot of my time flying above the Vale of York, wrestling with the atmosphere above it and trying to really stay up as long as I can, as safely as I can. It turns out that aviating is a very visceral way of trying to think through our relationships with the more than human world. The sky, it turns out, is a very big place. It turns out is a very powerful place. And it is certainly one that you can feel rather vulnerable in when you're sat there in your single seat glider, glaring out with sort of 6,000 feet below you before you hit the ground to try and avoid that. So it was in the process of doing this, my flight training and my kind of subsequent solo flying, that I was really kind of caught by trying to think, how can I even begin to articulate these experiences? What do they make me think about when it comes to my own existing digital practice? And so one of the things that I'd made was this project called Lines of Flight. And it consists of GPS tracks of the various flights that I've done over the course of the last couple of years, just simple GPS tracking on my phone. But what I've then done is that I then imported those tracks, and because they take place at sort of three dimensions, so latitude, longitude, and altitude, I then took those flights and at a very basic level, I visualized them in 3D as 3D structures in their own right, a three-dimensional trace. But then, because a lot of my practice is about words and and using sort of poetry in particular as a mode of articulating, as a mode of sensing the world. And so what I decided to do was I thought, well, is there a way that I can use gliding as a tool of writing? If you think about the inscriptions of in the air that is made by a glider moving through it, well, maybe that is a kind of a mode of writing in itself, as a mode of sensation that is then being recorded by these digital infrastructures of GPS, this sort of military commercial enterprise. And so what I did was that I then created something that I call an Aeolian AI. And it sort of is an AI, but isn't. It uses machine learning to extract a series of vectors between a vintage aviation text to create a kind of a language space that maps out the relationships between these terms that were being used to characterize the history of flight. And effectively, what I've done, to put it in very simple terms, was I used the GPS tracks as mathematical vectors as a way of querying this language space to then pull out interrelated strings of words that are then mapped out along the flight path. It's something that's easier to describe mathematically or through algorithms than verbally. The simple analogy is that I'm setting up a sort of an environment in which my glider, through the GPS tracking, is going through a gigantic cube of words. And each time the glider encounters a word, that is then comes up and is mapped out on the point on the flight path where it comes out. And that analogy gets across what I've been trying to do. So literally using the glider as a tool of writing within this sort of quasi-virtual space that is nevertheless made up in terms of its tracing through not just GPS tracking, but of course the atmospheric conditions at the time, my flight decisions. So it's this kind of combination of sensing, mapping, and then trying to analyze that after the fact, in this case, using these sort of Aeolian AI models. So, and what I was trying to do here was, again, think through how do we articulate these encounters that are so visceral, that are so embodied, that are so driven by movements on wind and wing in the real time of practice. And of course, you can't really do that without actually being there. So what's the next best thing? And how could I use that as a way of rethinking maybe what even AI systems might be going forward into the future? This vision of AI at the moment is one of something that sits in a data center in California, air conditioned in this very rarefied ecosystem. What if the AI was something that was powered by the wind? What if it was something that was responsive to material traces and actions in the real time of practice, rather than something that synthesizes it after the fact? What would it look like? What would it do? What kinds of sensation would it make tractable to us? And in the case here, in a form of three-dimensional concrete poetry, it doesn't present to us a straightforward sort of geometric map of flight paths and vectors and airspaces. It presents us something, a kind of a navigable volume that we can look at in different dimensions. We can draw the word associations together. We create a space for reflection on human and more than human atmospheric relations. There's not an answer here. There's not a quantified analysis of what the atmosphere is doing. Instead, it's an intersection of multiple forces, processes, infrastructures, ways of knowing and being, and thinking through, well, if we took those forces together and try to visualize them and articulate them, what would they look like? What would it be? So it's very much a speculative gesture along those lines. But that was something that I was, again, it's been very recently released. And again, it's I think is a really good example of some of the things that I've been doing. Now, another kind of project that I've been working on just before that was called Algorithmic Light. So this project was a response to the rhetorics that surround areas of outstanding natural beauty in the United Kingdom. I think they're now called national landscapes, but these areas are designated by effectively the UK government as being areas that are exceptional in their beauty, exceptional in terms of how they characterize a certain vision of what Britain is like somehow, the variety and preciousness of its landscapes. And it's a very pastoral vision. It gives a sense that these landscapes are timeless, unchanging, and eternal. And with the emphasis upon natural beauty, it can somehow suggest that they've always been like that somehow, that this is how they were. They've somehow miraculously survived into the modern world, and we need to cherish them. Now, clearly, we do need to cherish our landscapes, but these are not natural landscapes at all. They have been transformed over many thousands of years of human activity. They do not resemble the landscapes that existed 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And actually, they've undergone a very considerable change, even in the last 100 years or so, and are still undergoing considerable change, not just through straight, direct human activity in terms of curating these landscapes, but the fact we are in a world experiencing very serious climatic and ecological change that will impact these landscapes very profoundly into the future. So partly it was just to kind of my effort here was to kind of acknowledge the fact these landscapes are changed and are changing. So what I did was I set up a sort of a staring array, really a static camera in these landscapes. It was coupled to a machine vision routine that sort of took these durational time-lapse images, and it recorded everything that it saw in the scene that changed: clouds, wind, animals in this particular case here. And instead of designating these areas as, say, this is a rock, this is a tuft of grass, this is an animal, this is a cloud, because it wasn't really doing that. It wasn't looking for objects in the scene. It was just looking for change. It labels these areas of change using a lexicon that's drawn from a really pioneering work of, I don't know how you would characterize it, eco-archaeological writing, as sometimes people call it, and it's written by Jacquetta Hawkes, called A Land. 1950, and it was very much a sort of paean to the history of the sort of the British landscapes and how they have evolved and changed over the years. So it's a poetry generating apparatus once again in some respects, but it's very much tied to the landscapes of which it is part. It's another effort at trying to emphasize durational change, to emphasize the fact that these landscapes are not apart, living in aspects somehow. They are part of our world, part of a world that's being profoundly shaped by climatic change, human-driven change, as well as other factors and forces. And as part of that is, of course, digital forces as well, driving modes of extraction, driving modes of managing landscapes for their resources, for their value. And here, as an outstanding area of outstanding natural beauty, these are resources. These are commercial assets as a way of kind of boosting tourism as much as anything else, apart from being sort of often working farmlands as well. So this was an effort at, again, thinking through modes of sensing a landscape that can tell other stories about that landscape as well, to make us think and consider and be sensitive in this particular case. They're kind of the micro scales of change upon which far bigger changes evolve over time, over the course of years, decades, and centuries, which ultimately deliver to us the reality of climate change and its impacts upon the world. Again, there's multiple different stories that you can tell concerning a project like this in the form that it's been published in. Each landscape has got a series of field notes accompanying it, in which I basically talk about how difficult it was to do this project. The cameras were blown over, I was rained on, there were animals that wandered up, there were even humans that wandered up wanting to know what was going on, constantly interrupting and kind of disrupting the apparatus. But of course, that's part of the point. Again, these landscapes are not still, silent, dead areas. They are alive. They are constantly moving, constantly changing, and will always do so. And I think that's part of the process as well, trying to articulate the messiness and the difficulty of trying to gather any sort of digital data about a landscape. These are not views from nowhere. These are views from the ground within a space affected by the materialities of that space as well. This particular scene here, in case you're interested, it is taken from Roughton looking towards Brownwilly in North Cornwall in the United Kingdom. So this is the North Cornwall area of outstanding natural beauty. And I care about it a lot because it is my family home. It's a landscape I'm very familiar with and have known more or less throughout my entire life. So it was nice to do a project involving some of that. Okay, so I'm aware that I'm sort of coming up to time, so I'm just going to go through, just mention one other project that I'm doing right now, which is a very different vector actually, but nevertheless still draws upon some of these themes I've just articulated for you. So this is called Dronatope. This is a volumetric timeline of modern drone history. So we think of drones in various different contexts, but one of the things they do is they are sensor carrying objects. And they use those sensors for all sorts of ends, yes, military, but also environmental, ecological, and scientific as well. Again, from an archaeological standpoint, the use of drone surveillance to understand the landscape and structures within it. And what we were wanting to do as part of this project was to really just tell the story of modern drone history, but instead of it being this sort of great teleological arc of progress, some sort of big bang in which the first drone emerges, and then everything that happened since then just followed a nice, neat, clean story of inevitability, we wanted to try to find a way of, frankly, articulating the mess, the chaos and the contingency of all sorts of different experiments overlapping, getting in the way of one another, some things happening in some areas and emerging in others to enable other things to happen as well. We were trying to get across a sense of overlapping stories. I don't quite have quite enough time to show the visualization in full here, but what you see on the picture kind of gets that across quite neatly. So you've got really it's a series of nodes running across a calendar grid belonging to different themes, and they're stacked on top of one another, a bit like a deck of cards. They do have a connecting line between them, a bit like the circuits of the London Underground, so you can follow them if you want. But nevertheless, when you sort of zoom in and out, you see this sort of three-dimensional volumetric structure of different clusters of activity, say commercial or military, political, artistic, regulatory. You can kind of see they kind of emerge a bit like constellations in the space rather than necessarily clear, neat vectors going from one direction of time, along a single temporal vector. And so the idea is as you move and navigate through the space, these different nodes, they kind of overlap one another, they kind of zoom in, zoom out. you don't ever get a single clear, obvious sense of what's going on. Instead, you actually realize that the development of the drone is a contingent history. And of course, like any history, you can tell different stories about this notionally the same events in space and time, depending on how you look at it, quite literally in this case. I mean, Dronotype is different from my other projects, apart from the fact it doesn't have a very obvious ecological theme, but it was collaboratively made. So it was made as part of the Drone Life project that I'm doing with the Centre for Drones and Culture at the University of Cambridge. It was developed as a research exposition primarily, rather than an artistic one. So this was really a way of visualizing our understanding of the developments of drone technology. And indeed, it has certain, I won't say compromises, but they have certain elements that are designed to make it more usable in a conventional sense. So it has this, it has help menus and tooltips and other useful things to aid navigation. But it's an interesting project because there was the tension. Some people struggle to see this as a usable research tool because it's too uncertain. There's too many overlaps. They want a clear story. They want the data points that make it up to come to them. They want to be told what is going on at any one point. They want to be able to understand a clear set of relations. And here, that's not what's going on at all. Instead, it's much, much more uncertain. So again, although this isn't sort of a poetic piece and isn't an artistic piece, it still embodies, I think, a way of telling a story where the uncertainty is the point, where the doubt is the point, where you have to start to be confronted by a way of measuring and mapping out the world in a way that doesn't neatly conform. So let's just try to wrap up with a quick conclusion as to kind of what I'm doing. Again, there's multiple stories and multiple conclusions. Here is one of them that we might reach. All the technology behind all the things that I've just made, that I've just shown you, is actually quite simple. Even if I use words like AI and what have you, they aren't mechanically that challenging in terms of what they are, though it took a while to get there. And that's very deliberate. It's quite unlike the scale and intensity and complexity of generative AI as we know it today, and big digital arts projects more generally. You can run these pieces using a browser or a low-end computer, and you have no trouble at all. They are deliberately not meant to be intensive and complex at that kind of level. And, at one level, you might think, oh, that's a bit of a failure there, because many technical artworks are presented, at least in terms of the big gallery artworks of the digital art, as being intensive and complex and almost having a sort of techno sublime about them in that complexity and scale. But nevertheless, what I've been trying to do in having these projects as quite simple and being embedded in quite unusual contexts, telling unusual stories, I want to make the suggestion that the worlds they are encoding and encountering are actually much more interesting than the machinery itself, or how it operates, or even to an extent what it actually generates as well. It's their status as being part of a more than human media formation that I think is the most interesting bit about them, and is the thing that they're trying to ultimately emphasize. They're much more like land art in some respects, where really they're just a frame for what we're seeing, as opposed to being the star of the show in themselves, which can very often be the case for digital media artwork. And so I guess my kind of round off provocation coming out of all the things that I do is really essentially this. What if we had digital media practices, whether they're artistic or academic or industrial, that they were actually more self-effacing in some respects, that decenter themselves from our critical and our aesthetic attention, where actually we start to realize that the digital is but one aspect of what's going on here. And indeed, actually quite a small aspect. It's the story of the aerial encounters within my gliding flight, or the changes that we're seeing in the landscape, or indeed the kind of the chaos and mess of drone development. That's much more interesting than necessarily how it is being delivered to us. For actually, yes, it might be initial hook, thinking, oh, what's going on here? But then we realize that's the most interesting story. It's the story of what happened in the making of these pieces and the stories that they encode. I guess ultimately, what if we had computing digital artworks that suggest there are more engaging, enriching, and valuable stories to be told than its digital aspects alone, where the digital is in effect put in its place as part of this more than human media world in which we ultimately live in. I guess that is my provocation when I do any of my artworks, and I hope that at the very least is a provocation you can take with you towards your own work going forward with machines. Do we need these machines at all? And if so, can we actually make them perhaps less interesting in some respects, to instead concentrate on other kinds of stories? So I hope you found that interesting, and thank you very much for listening. So that QR code is to my site, by the way, but obviously you've got it there at the bottom of the screen for all of you. Oh, good time.